Hello, my name is Robert Presutti. I'm the corporate archivist for Dollar Bank. I want to thank you for tuning in tonight for the first event in the Dollar Bank Duquesne Pittsburgh History Speaker Series. This event was initially planned to be an in-person event, but due to the circumstances, we had to make it a virtual event. So thank you for tuning in. This is the first of many to come, and tonight's presentation will be focused on early immigration to Pittsburgh. The speaker series itself is the result of a collaboration between Dollar Bank and the Duquesne History Department, in which the goal is to create new research and raise awareness of Pittsburgh's local history. The archive department at Dollar Bank was established in 2014, and it includes records of enduring value for the organization that goes back to the establishment of the bank in 1855. Dollar Bank is a mutual bank, and it's in our charter to conduct activities that are both mutually advantageous for the bank and the local community. We're here 3 presentations tonight. Each are about 20 minutes long, and then there'll be a short question and answer period at the end of the presentations. First, we'll be listening to Anna Samuels, who is Librarian Archivist at the Pittsburgh History and Landmarks Foundation. Her presentation is titled Architectural Narratives, Immigrant History of the Built Environment in Pittsburgh's Southside. Second, we'll hear from Cassidee Knott, who is a Master of Arts candidate in the Public History Graduate Program at Duquesne. Her presentation is titled Parting Glass, Irish Immigrants and Their Culture in Pittsburgh. Finally, we'll hear from Michael Tusay, Facilitator at Bushy Run Battlefield. His presentation, Addio Bel Paese, Ciao Città d'Acciaio, A Brief History of Pittsburgh's Italian Immigrants. But I wanted to quickly make a note that we are broadcasting live from Dollar Bank's historic 4th Avenue building, located downtown, and we'll explore a little bit more of the building later in the event. So thank you very much. Now I want to introduce Assistant Professor of History, Drew Simpson from Duquesne University.
Thanks, Bob. Good evening. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody today, at least virtually, in this wonderful space that we'll talk about more over the course of the presentation. For the last several years, Duquesne University's Department of History has had an ongoing and expanding relationship with Dollar Bank. Each spring, the bank hosts 2 interns. One intern is a student from our MA in Public History program in their corporate archives, and another student comes from our traditional MA in History program, and they engage in project-based historical research under the supervision of the bank's marketing department. We're delighted that our speakers this evening represent former recipients of both internships. And on a personal note, I'm delighted that they're all former or current students of mine. It's really a pleasure, and it's very exciting to be here. We think that this partnership speaks to a shared interest in telling a story about how our region's past shapes its future. And to that end, I want to say some thank yous to folks at Dollar Bank. In particular, I'd thank Robert Bushy, who you've met, who's Dollar Bank's corporate archivist, Dorothy Spangler, who's a multimedia production specialist and joining us today, Victor Labonte, Vice President, Operations Management, and Joseph Smith, Senior Vice President of Marketing. We want to thank them for all of their work in helping to make sure that these internships are possible and continue moving forward. Tonight's theme of exploring the history and the impact on our community of immigration is one that's not only a natural fit for Dollar Bank, but also for Duquesne. As many of us already know, Pittsburgh has long been a destination for immigration and migration. Historian William Dietrich II has argued that between 1870 and 1910, Pittsburgh's population grew from around 86,000 people to more than 530,000. And around 26% of that 530,000 were immigrants. Now, that growth brought vast changes to our region, and this has been a project for generations of Pittsburgh's historians, including Joel Tarr, John Bauman, and Edward Muller, who've documented the impacts of this rapid growth on our city's natural and built environments. Individuals born overseas and their children have played a key role in the Pittsburgh story. And as our city's manufacturing sector grew throughout the 19th century, migration and immigration provided an important solution to this acute labor shortage. Now, some migrants arrived in our region with skills that were related to our growing industries, while others provided the hard labor that built Pittsburgh. Often immigrants followed family members or people from their own home regions. Many stayed, laying down roots here in our city. Others returned back to their countries of origin after a period of time. But it's important to remember that for as much as people were pulled to Western Pennsylvania, they were also pushed out of their homes by war, famine, and religious discrimination. Thus, the decision to immigrate then as it is now is one that is shaped by both broad economic and political forces, and also the choices made by individuals and families. The wave of immigration that we'll talk about tonight, one that was building around 1870 and crested around 1910, was not just limited to Pittsburgh. Historian Roy Luboff reminds us that in Allegheny County alone in 1910, excluding Pittsburgh, there was a population of a little over 1 million people, and 271,000 were foreign-born, and another 342,000 were the children of the foreign-born. Luboff also reminds us that immigrants settled throughout our region, not just in Allegheny County or Pittsburgh, but in many of the counties surrounding where we are today, helping to create their own unique history and trajectory. But immigrants brought more than just their labor to Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania. They brought cultural and religious traditions, foods, which many of us still enjoy today, and a desire to build institutions and communities. And in fact, Duquesne has its own ties to Pittsburgh's immigration story, as my colleague Joseph Rischel has shown in his excellent history, The Spirit That Gives Life. Today's Duquesne University was founded by German priests, the Holy Ghost Fathers, in 1878 as the Pittsburgh Catholic College. And over the next decades, numerous other foreign-born priests, often Irish, guided the university's development and transition into a university. Our city's immigrants and their children have always been important parts of Duquesne. For example, not far from where we are tonight, here on 4th Avenue, in 1911, Duquesne founded their law school, which at the time was the only program to offer night classes. In 1913, we founded our business school, sharing space with the law school on 4th Avenue. And by 1916, Duquesne had founded a school of social services dedicated to addressing the problems of Pittsburgh's rapid growth. And so you see that the story of immigration and the story of Duquesne and the story of Dollar Bank are all intertwined together, and I think that's something that our speakers will bring out tonight. We hope that tonight will become an annual event. We hope that future events will discuss a range of issues related to Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania's history, hopefully going in a range of different directions, including updating the story of immigration to show how new immigrants to our region have changed as we move from an industrial economy to one where education and medicine play critical roles. The story of these immigrants has yet to be fully told, and we hope to be able to do that in the future. Just a quick programming note. So we're really looking forward to questions, and I know our panelists are. We've reserved time at the end. We're going to ask that you use the chat feature to go ahead and put your question into the chat. I will do my best. I'll be moderating questions. I'll do my best to get to as many questions as possible, and we certainly appreciate your engagement and your time. Thanks again for joining us this evening, and on behalf of Duquesne's Department of History, I'd like to take just one more quick moment to thank some folks, our speakers who are joining us here, all of the folks from Dollar Bank who've made this event possible, the dedicated event and marketing staff at Duquesne who provided invaluable assistance. I'd like to thank Tom White, our university archivist, for providing the photos you saw at the beginning of this presentation, Sydney Yates, one of our Master's in History students, for helping to assemble this presentation, Alex Warren, who is a History MA student in Public History. For those of you who are interested, please follow along on our Twitter account. Alex is live tweeting the event at DUQ History. And Kelly Kowalski, our department's administrative assistant, who's also provided a great deal of assistance. So thank you much. We hope that you enjoy tonight's event, and we appreciate your attendance here today.
Okay, hi. I'm Anna Samuels. As Bob mentioned before, I'm going to be talking about architectural narratives and specifically how the built environment in Pittsburgh's Southside can tell us a lot about the immigrant history there. All right, so I am a librarian and archivist at Pittsburgh History and Landmarks Foundation. I graduated from the Public History Master's program at Duquesne last spring, and during my final semester there, I interned with Bob at Dollar Bank in the corporate archives. While at Duquesne, I focused specifically on oral history and the way that memory impacts narrative. And my work at PHLF has really allowed me to dig more into the built environment and the role of historic preservation, which has really, you'll see, been influential for my research today. I've also included my contact information at the bottom of the screen. In case you have any burning questions for me, you can reach me there. Okay, so tonight I am talking about the Southside. And the Southside, for anyone who's not familiar, is located along the south bank of the Monongahela River, across the river from downtown Pittsburgh. This area was originally split into 4 separate boroughs: South Pittsburgh, Birmingham, East Birmingham, and Ormsby, and was later annexed to the city of Pittsburgh in 1872. In the 70s and 80s, there was actually a move to designate the neighborhood Historic Birmingham, so already we see this reaching back to an earlier history there. So my introduction to the Southside really came when I started volunteering with the Southside Voices Oral History Project in the spring of 2018. This was a project that was organized by the Southside Community Council, the Carnegie Library Southside branch, and a Coro fellow named Juliet. They were the ones that really got the ball rolling on this. The project's aim was to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the East Carson Historic District designation. And they were hoping to do that by highlighting not only the neighborhood and the area of East Carson Street, but really individual buildings there. And you'll notice if you look at the handouts here, we had listed some specific buildings that narrators could think about before they came to do their recordings. So there were 2 collection days held at the Carnegie Library in the Southside, and we were collecting narratives and figuring out what we wanted to create with those narratives. A little bit about oral history before we go any further. Oral history is a field of study and a method of gathering and interpreting recorded interviews. And this is an interview exchange that requires both an interviewer and an interviewee, who is often referred to as the narrator. And in this way, oral history is different from, say, a solo recording, because this relationship that's established between the interviewer and the narrator is an incredibly important part of oral history. These are audio or video recordings that are later archived. And oral history is often referred to as history from the bottom up, because unlike more traditional sources that you might find in your libraries or your archives, oral history is focused on amplifying the voices of people who have not traditionally been recorded. In this way, oral history can fill in the gaps in the historical record. And specifically with the Southside Voices Project, we had a benefit of focusing on specific buildings that really allowed us to kind of keep this project grounded. Though it's really exciting that oftentimes you can ask somebody a question and end up somewhere completely differently, it's also nice to have that anchor if you want to make sure you get that answer. So I ended up staying on with the Southside Voices Oral History Project as an intern during the summer of 2018. And my responsibility there was really processing of the interviews for transcription and keyword cataloging. And through this process, I started noticing patterns in the interviews, patterns of personal and shared immigrant histories, all layers anchored by the built environment and different layers of these immigrant histories coming out. So the first layer of shared immigrant histories that I saw was the founding of the Southside. And this was really coming up. I noticed these repeated names coming up at the interviews, and as somebody who really had no background in the history of the Southside, I learned very quickly. So these repeated names were John Ormsby, Dr. Nathaniel Bedford, and some street names as well. So John Ormsby was an Irish immigrant. He fought in the French and Indian War and was gifted the land that became the Southside. Dr. Nathaniel Bedford was his son-in-law. He later inherited the land and laid out the Southside. And so already we see this base layer of immigrant history relating to the very founding of this neighborhood. Street names also came up a lot. This image here is Sarah Street in the Southside, which was named for John Ormsby's daughter. There are various streets throughout the Southside named for Ormsby children. And so again, we see this immigrant history literally mapped onto the landscape. This was an interesting thing to notice, that really this public history became incredibly personal in the way that the narrators were talking about it. So one of the first questions that we would ask as interviewers was, tell me about growing up on the South Side, or what's it like living on the South Side? And yet narrators came back to these repeated names again and again. So this history was really functioning as a shared immigrant history, and what I was even envisioning as sort of a shared creation story, something that's repeated by many people and is part of how they understand their home. The second layer of shared immigrant histories that I picked up on, I'm calling these ethnic enclaves, ethnic communities within the Southside. These manifested as both personal immigrant histories as well as broader place-based immigrant histories. And again, the narration patterns here were defined in almost geographic terms, similar to the way that we see the streets being mapped earlier. This image actually is a painting by Lee Ditley, who was the son of a Swiss immigrant who lived in the South Side. And I want to share a quote from one of the transcripts here to illustrate my point. Okay, so this narrator said, I think the interesting feature about the South Side was the ethnic communities. My grandfather was Welsh English. They lived on Sydney Street. That was known as the Welsh English neighborhood. And if you go through the South Side, you had the Serbians and the Lithuanians and the Ukrainians and the Polish and the Irish. I think the history of the South Side that I remember when all these things were taking place, as the parishes closed, the South Side's identity was lessened to a degree. So you can really see here how this narrator is understanding his experience and a broader immigrant experience in the South Side in geographic terms, mapped out across these different streets. And he touches on something that I'll come back to later, which is the way that memory is tied to specific built structures and what happens when those places are not there anymore. The third and final layer of immigrant histories that I picked up on in these interviews were the specific buildings along East Carson Street. And this is where we really see the importance of the built environment for the Southside Voices oral history project, and where the bulk of immigrant history came out in the interviews. And this I thought was a really interesting, almost inverse of that first question, tell me about the South Side, because here we see these incredibly personal memories tied to specific buildings, specific places, becoming almost public, in that they are shared in public spaces that everybody can enjoy. So I want to share a few examples of these specific buildings that are tied to this immigrant history. So the first one we have is Fathead Saloon. So this is a popular bar and restaurant in the South Side. Obviously, it wasn't always that. This is a photo of the buildings before, two buildings, 1805 and 1807, East Carson Street. And this building used to be a real estate and notary public. And the narrator that I talked to shared this about the buildings. They said, my great-grandfather was John Henry Sorg. He was an orphan who immigrated here from Germany in 1852. He apprenticed with a contractor and became a builder, and Fatheads, which he built in 1874, was his last building. You can still see the name Sorg on the very bottom outside cornerstone. And so I thought this was really interesting because Here we have a literal stamp on the foundation of a building, something that is still there. You walk down the street and you can see it, even though this building now looks completely different. Department stores, immigrant-owned department stores came up in the interviews. Wushner Brothers is at 1514 East Carson Street. This is now Mario's, which is a popular bar. But originally it was opened by a Russian immigrant, B.W. Wushner. And similar to the stamping on Fatheads, Wushner's is still tiled in the entryway of now Mario's. So again, you have this architectural stamp there of an earlier history. One of the narrators who was reflecting on this had said that being in old family buildings, quote, feels like home. Baron Bregg's Umbrella Store, another immigrant-owned store opened by German immigrants, Bernard and Mary Baron Bregg. And again, this building looks different than it did then. It's now a Pizza Hut, but having that space there and that building and being able to connect those memories to that space was important for this narrator and the narrators that reflected on this. The Market House is another great example of this. So the Market House is in Bedford Square. It was built in 1893, later burned down and rebuilt. And this was an area that was gifted to the Southside residents on the condition that the land be used for public purposes. So again, we see a very obviously public space that holds a lot of personal memories. This is a gathering place for immigrant populations in the Southside, and a lot of narrators shared memories connected to this building. Someone even wrote a poem. There were, of course, buildings that didn't come up in the interviews, either because they weren't on East Carson Street or just because we couldn't talk all day. But some of the important ones to mention that have this immigrant influence are the nationality churches in the Southside, the schools that are linked to them, and the mills and factories. So in this photo, you can see St. Michael's on the right. St. Michael's, founded in 1848. By 1860, it had the largest German congregation in Western Pennsylvania. This building was designed by a German architect, Charles Bartberger, and he was inspired by rural churches in Bavaria. And so really seeing this immigrant influence being represented in a concrete way in the landscape. It's now condos, so it's nice that the building is still there. You know, there's still that connection there, even though it's not a church anymore. St. Adalbert's is a Polish church, and St. Casimir's Lithuanian, also condos. Schools, as I mentioned, connected to these nationality churches, and again, places that definitely evoke those memories when you're talking to people, when you're walking through a neighborhood. And then mills and factories. The Southside was a huge glass production center. J&L Steel Mill was nearby. So again, places where immigrants were working, were making memories. So, as we can see, the architecture is playing a really big role in the Southside Voices Oral History Project, and especially in the way that it's really igniting people's memories. Architecture can maintain a sense of place, it encourages dialogue, it maintains memories, and also really functions as a universal language, which is especially important when we're talking about immigrant populations and people that maybe don't speak the dominant language in an area, being able to see a place and recognize it as some place where they can feel safe. St. Michael's is a great example of this, means a lot. Another example of this is the building where we're presenting from tonight, the historic 4th Avenue branch of Dollar Bank. The image here is Dollar Bank. As you can see, a very grand building, columns, ornamentation. It looks like a place where you would want to put your money. And this building was designed by Isaac Hobbs in 1871. The From the website, this information says, the building's lavish design and use of imported New England stone were expressions of robust confidence, marking the emergence of Pittsburgh as an industrial and financial heavyweight on the American scene. And we can see that from the 1870s to the 1880s, so in the 9 years after this building was designed and built, 38% of new depositors at Dollar Bank were immigrants. And so we see that unspoken universal language really coming through here. It's hard to talk about architecture if we don't also talk about historic preservation. And so historic preservation is the other part of this equation that keeps these memories alive. And historic preservation is built on the premise that preserving neighborhoods and preserving structures is beneficial. This is an alternative to urban renewal. In this way, we're able to maintain memories tied to specific buildings and neighborhoods. And this is really accomplished through different historic designation guidelines and Main Street programs that impose restrictions on architectural changes, so you're not wiping out places and making them look completely different. It bears mentioning that for every neighborhood that is saved, a lot of neighborhoods aren't. And we need to think about what happens when architecture and buildings aren't preserved. Something that most Pittsburghers are probably familiar with is the razing of the Lower Hill District in the 1950s to build the Civic Arena. Dominique Lester, who is the Teenie Harris Archivist at the Carnegie Museum of Art, talks about how urban renewal is a tool that can silence landscapes, and how those silenced landscapes are then reflected in the archives. If there isn't anything to connect those memories to, we don't have those memories. And so being aware of what happens when neighborhoods are demolished, what's being taken away in the moment and what's being taken away in the past and in the present where we don't have those memories. So I want to share a couple more quotes about memory on the Southside in these interviews. And really, it was interesting the way that narrators were picking up on memory and connecting it to buildings. So one narrator says, my daughters always laugh at me because as we walk down the streets, I'm always telling them what the places used to be before what they are now. And so this awareness of, because I know what was here, I can share that memory, but when I'm gone, you're not going to know what was here. And being able to see this almost ghost city laid on top. And in terms of historic preservation, another narrator had said that the benefit of historic preservation is that the past can stay alive in the present of the neighborhood and encourage a sense of belonging, a sense of familiarity that is healthy for the citizens of a neighborhood. When you walk into a building, it evokes memories if you've been there before and you have an emotional connection to the building. So really, really emphasizing that point that these memories are living in these buildings and what happens when these places are gone. And so to wrap it up, the built environment and oral history. So I really noticed the way, obviously, physical structures were acting as concrete historical touchstones throughout this project, and architecture and oral history were supporting and empowering each other in a way that was new to me. Working on this project, listening to the interviews and then walking through the Southside, I was reacting to the landscape and to the buildings in a way that I know I would not have if I hadn't heard these stories, if people hadn't shared these memories with me. And I think that though this shared immigrant history is evident to the people that live there, it comes up all the time when you talk to people, it's probably not obvious to outsiders or maybe to people who have moved to the area. And so really making a point to celebrate this history, especially in a climate and a time when some immigrants may not feel welcome, making sure to be aware and to celebrate the ways that immigrants have made this neighborhood. Thank you. Oh, and there's my sources.
Thank you, Anna, very much. In the short interim before we have the second presentation, I just wanted to go through and explain a little about what we have in the Dollar Bank archives. The corporate archives comprise of ledgers, photographs, even some films of the bank's activities from 1855 to the present. It's been cited that the Dollar Bank archives is the largest collection of organizational records for an institution that has not been damaged by fire or flood. Usually records that are stored in the 1800s in buildings or different companies, they would be destroyed along the way, but Dollar Bank's was not, and that's probably due to the care that they were kept. One of the most interesting records in the corporate archives is what we call a signature book. And signature books, as you can imagine, is where someone would sign for a new account before computerization. They would come into the bank and they wanted to open an account, and what they would do, as you could see on the next slide, is sign their name and some information about themselves, such as what they do for a job and how old they were, where they lived in the city. Back then, this book is from the 1860s. In the slide, Pittsburgh was actually, as we know it today, was 3 cities. North side was Allegheny City, and then center Pittsburgh, and Southside was Birmingham. But what's interesting about these books is you can see in the context of immigrant history that below the description of their job, it often cited where they were born. Now, some people were born right in Pennsylvania, others came from other places around the United States, but there were a lot of people that came from Europe, and we have these in our records. So what we basically have is a database of hundreds of these books that cite all the names of different people that came to the United States, where they lived, and what country they came from. And we have their actual signatures. And so that's something very personal and something that is very important to preserve. So some of the signature books are on display in the Heritage Center at the historic 4th Avenue branch. During normal times, there's a little area that's kind of like a museum that you can come and view some of the archival materials. It's closed now due to the virus situation, but hopefully in the future, soon, they would be open. There's rotating exhibits, and it's something that's really interesting to look at if you're interested in the intersection of the history of economics and the growth of the city of Pittsburgh. Thank you very much. And I'll hand it off to Cassidee Knott.
My presentation is called Parting Glass, Irish Immigrants and Their Culture in Pittsburgh. So just a little bit about me as we start. I am a second-year master's candidate in the public history program. I began in 2019, and we're hoping to graduate in 2021. I concentrate a lot in archival studies as well as oral history. Before coming to Duquesne, I started at the University of Pittsburgh from 2015 to 2019, and I got my BA in history. And through Pitt, I was able to study abroad in Ireland in 2017. As you can see, there's a picture of me there at the Cliffs of Moher. And overall, areas of interest, I study 20th century Ireland and Pittsburgh steel. So just a bit of explanation about my title. What is a parting glass? It is traditionally a Scottish folk song that is usually sung around the end of gatherings and events, just as a way to say, hey, I know we're all separating, but we're going to see each other again. And this song was then later adopted by the Irish, and topically, the artist Hosier, who's Irish, just sang this song around March to commemorate all of the losses during COVID-19. And I've really found the song to be extremely prevalent with the immigration of the Irish to America. So just a brief overview of Irish history. I could go on for ages about this, but I'm going to give you the rundown. So it's an island in the northern Atlantic Ocean. It's the second largest of the British Isles, so it's currently split into two, even though it's one island. So in 1921, the bottom 26 counties, that's the darker in the image, they got their own freedom out of Great Britain. And the remaining 6 counties at the top there, lighter green, is Ulster, Ireland, and they are still under the dominion of Great Britain. Religiously, the 26 counties at the bottom are usually Catholic, and historically the top 6 are Protestant. Now, this has caused a lot of issues within Ireland that then later spurred a lot of this Irish immigration. So in terms of coming to America, the distance between Ireland and the United States is about 4,000 miles. Now today that's about 10 to 14 hours via airplane. And Pittsburgh does not have direct flights out of Pittsburgh Airport into Ireland, so you usually have to take a connecting flight. Now that seems like a lot of time, but back then, with these early immigrants to America, they did not have the luxury of airplanes, so they usually took ships like the one pictured. So that could take anywhere from 4 to 10 weeks, depending on the size of the ship and the wind at the time. Now, the ship we have pictured here is the infamous Titanic in 1912. It was actually built in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and there's actually a museum dedicated to that construction and Titanic today. So the Irish came to Pittsburgh in about 2 waves, and the first wave began in the 18th century until about the 1840s. This consisted of primarily Protestants seeking religious freedom in the area. This consisted of about 250,000 people, and they were considered Ulster Scots, which seems really confusing because they weren't Scottish, they were Irish. And they came to Pennsylvania because it was considered a religious refuge. So Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn, and he was actually owed a lot of money by the British Crown, and their way of paying him was giving him colonial territory here in Pennsylvania. And having been jailed for his Quaker religious beliefs, he ended up taking that and making this area a religious refuge. So it became not just for Quakers, but for others seeking religious asylum. So in terms of Pittsburgh directly relating to Irish immigrants, the Southside area of Pittsburgh was actually owned by an Irish immigrant. He settled the area around 1763. It was actually a gift to him by King George III, and it was about 3 miles, and it was to reward him for participating in the construction of Fort Pitt. Now, his family ended up moving here, and it ended up getting split up amongst his children as to what we know as the Southside today. Now, the second wave is probably where I'm going to be concentrating the majority of this presentation. This was from 1845 into the 20th century. So they left for a variety of reasons. They left because of rising rent in Ireland, the decline of the Irish linen trade, political unrest, but the major reason they left was due to the Great Potato Famine. Now this lasted from 1845 to 1846 officially, but it lasted much longer in terms of trying to get their populations back up. So today we call it the Great Potato Famine or the Great Hunger. It basically boiled down to a really poor potato harvest that year. The potatoes had become infested with an organism like fungus. This ruined up to a half to 1/3 of the crop in the area for the next 7 years. Now, due to the tenement farming of the area, the Irish, usually Irish Catholics who were farming this land, didn't actually own it. So whatever viable crop they ended up getting was then shipped off to the other isles in Britain. So a lot of the Irish suffered even though they had a bit of viable crop. Now, this is extremely still in the memory of Irish today. Some even consider it a genocide. Over the next 10 years during the famine, 750,000 Irish people died, and 2 million left their homeland to places like Great Britain, Canada, and here in the United States. In the decades following the famine, 1.5 million people moved to the United States directly. They went to places like Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, and then once they made it to those ports, they moved westward, and that's how we're seeing a lot of Pittsburgh Irish. So during this time period, many people traveled in steerage So when they would come to America, they'd be forced to feed themselves on the ship, and oftentimes it was so overcrowded that they would become sick, and in some cases even pass away before they could even arrive in America. In 1900, there were over 500,000 more Irish here than there were in Ireland. So once they came to Pittsburgh and finally got off the ship and they were in America, Pittsburgh was not very welcoming. So it was because they came as poor people. I mean, they suffered through an utter famine and had come here with what little left they had. They were forced into unskilled, low-paying jobs, and overall they weren't treated very well due to their religious beliefs. Now, because of these stereotypes and this forced eradication, this led to a lot of alcoholism, which is like an awful stereotype of Irish, but it also led to mental instability. Now, because of this unacceptance in the area, a lot of Irish immigrants did not marry outside of their own ethnic culture. So prior to 1900, about 22% of Irish men married non-Irish people, and about 14% of Irish women married outside of the Irish culture. Now, if they did marry into another ethnicity at this time period, they wouldn't be marrying any other immigrants. They'd be married what they would have called as native-born Americans. Now, the environment religiously wasn't very welcoming due to the Anglo-centric atmosphere of the United States during the time period. So as much as we as Americans like to believe we shed our our English ways of life when we became our own country, it wasn't exactly the case. So because Great Britain and places like that weren't very accepting of Catholic culture, America in turn was the same. And where they did find assistance and camaraderie was within the Catholic Church. So the Archdiocese of Pittsburgh, the Ancient Order of the Hibernians, and specifically in Pittsburgh, the Sisters of Mercy were extremely helpful in reacclimating to life here in Pittsburgh. So in talking about stereotypes, oftentimes men and women, regardless of what their names were, if they were Irish and they were an immigrant, they were called Patty if they were a man, or Bridget if they were a woman. And these stereotypes are often played out in vaudeville and theater shows, and they were accused of being lazy, loose, incompetent, and just awful stereotypes. So those who were moving to America during this early second wave were usually single younger people. So between 1880 and 1897, only about 7.9% of Irish immigrants were under the age of 15. It was primarily unmarried, single people moving here. And at the time, the men specifically were moving here because due to the inheritance situations in Great Britain at the time, any sort of land or money that their parents had upon their parents' death would go to the first living son. So in a lot of cases, if you were a second, third, fourth son in these large Irish families, you wouldn't be getting anything. So a lot of them moved to the United States to seek more prospects. So between 1851 and 1921, 4.5 million people left Ireland, 3.7 million people to the United States, and about half of those were men. And when they were moving to the United States, and specifically into Pittsburgh, they were moving out of rural areas of Ireland into these big cities because there was more job opportunities and you were close to other Irish immigrants. So what was the daily life like for an Irish immigrant male? On the left-hand side here, we see a picture from 1887 of Jones and Laughlin Steelworks in the Southside, and the two men in the front on the left were both Irish. So when they would move here, they'd be forced into a lot of dangerous, low-paying jobs. Usually, you think Pittsburgh steel, so they'd be in the mills, they'd be working on rail lines. This was a lot of blue-collar work, and it was extremely dangerous. Now, by 1900, if you worked in the Pennsylvania railroads, these Irish men and their families were able to ride the rails for free because they had worked for the company, which I guess is a little bit of recompense for the fact that they were risking their lives so often. Now, occasionally, these skilled immigrant men could come to the United States and continue practicing their skill, and this would be bankers, shopkeepers, doctors, but in a lot of cases, it was usually blue-collar work. Now, as time progressed, Irish immigrants were able to get better paying jobs, and then a lot of them would consider the profession of a cop, which is an awful stereotype that we still have today, that a lot of Irish people are cops, and they were called Paddy the Cop. And between 1870 and 1900, we saw a huge hike in men working in clerical and professional jobs. So it went from 8% to 15%. And then after the Great Depression, after Prohibition, obviously bar ownership in the city of Pittsburgh went up, especially with your typical Irish pub. Now, women had a different kind of restriction in terms of what kind of work they did. So during the second wave, more women left Ireland than men had. In fact, more single Irish women, left Ireland for America than any other European ethnic group. And they typically came to America and did domestic services. So they'd work as maids, wet nurses, and the occasional midwife if they had that kind of training. Now, they would do this job until they were married, because once they were married, they could no longer take care of another family. They would be required to take care of their own. However, by the late 1800s, some women were leaving this domestic service and taking up white-collar work. So this would be nursing, teaching, and of course this paid more. And you saw a little bit less of women leaving their jobs once they were married. Now, if you look here on the right-hand side in the news clipping, you can see all of these wanted ads for things like maids and whatnot. And this was in 1914, and it's a big change because you're not seeing Irish need not apply in these wanted ads any longer. Oh, it's going crazy. All right, let me back up. You're getting a sneak peek. That's okay. Oh, okay, we're back. So once they came to America, they obviously had to find a place to live. And I just wanted to give a little Irish saying for you. And these were called Sean uncles. This would be folk sayings that you would say often in Gaelic. So a popular one is Níl ein tinton mar de hinton féin. So that means there's no hearth like your own hearth. In a lot of cases, these hearths would be a very loose description, because when the Irish would move here, they would take up residence wherever they could to survive. So in a lot of cases, this meant shanty towns, tenement living. There wasn't a lot of space, especially because of the stereotypes against them. Primarily, one really popular area when they would come here would be the Point, which we don't really consider to be a living space any longer, but they would move into the Point, the Hill District, Lawrenceville, Homewood, and other places. And in terms of the Point, the picture here on the left is of the Fort Pitt blockhouse located in Point State Park, and this was built in 1764. The blockhouse is all that remains of Fort Pitt today, and it was a large, elaborate British fort in the area, and it was a major defense during the French and Indian War. Now, this was then gifted to the city of Pittsburgh by the Daughters of the Revolution in 1894, and it remained free and open to visitors. And because of this, a lot of people moved into it because it was free, it was open, they flocked in, and this was a major issue because a lot of dangerous diseases would then rapidly take out these areas. Things like cholera, smallpox. It was also really dangerous because of the open rail lines and the mills that were located all around. Now, as stated before, a lot of Irish took solace in their religion during this time period. The Archdiocese of Pittsburgh began in 1843, and through the camaraderie of religion, a lot of Irish immigrants then felt more at home here in Pittsburgh. So our first church was at St. Patrick's in the Strip District. It began in 1808, burnt down, and was then rebuilt. And during the Great Depression, this church gave out over 2 million free meals, not only to Irish, but to all of those suffering in the city of Pittsburgh. The second church here in Pittsburgh was St. Paul's Church in 1834. This was originally in Grant Street in downtown, but that land was later sold, and they moved to Oakland today. And fun fact, the pipe organ that's inside of the Oakland location was actually donated by Andrew Carnegie. Now, another prominent Pittsburgh group in terms of religion is the Sisters of Mercy. So they came from Carlow, Ireland in 1843 to serve the Pittsburgh region. And during their time here in Pittsburgh, they served in 1848 in the typhus epidemic and began what is known today as the Mercy Hospital. They also started up a education system within the city of Pittsburgh. What began as Mount Mercy Academy was then renamed Mount Mercy College, and today we know it as Carlow University. Now, I can go on for ages about Irish culture here in Pittsburgh. There is so much, there's such an influence, but I think first thought we think of the St. Patrick's Day Parade here in the city. This began in 1869 by the organization, the Ancient Order of the Hibernians. And the Ancient Order of the Hibernians began as a way to protect Catholic clergy from biases by native-born Americans. The first chapter here in Pittsburgh was in 1850 in the Southside. Then just to wrap up, I want to connect back here to Dollar Bank, who were gracious enough to host this tonight. And if you look at the graphic, if you look at the green, you see all of the Irish immigrants depositing their money here at Dollar Bank. So they are almost consistently the largest new immigrant depositors here at Dollar Bank. They were the most depositors from 1896 to 1921, which is awesome. And what little money they could get here in the United States, they were depositing in this bank because luckily enough, it only took $1 to start your bank account. And that's all I have for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Cassidee. In the second interim, just 2 minutes, want to just go over a little bit about the building, which we've talked a few times tonight. Unfortunately, we couldn't have an in-person event, but hopefully in the future, many of you can come down and see the building firsthand. Anna spoke about how the building at 4th Avenue really portrays a sense of gravitas, a sense of protection of people's money. And the idea that they would use the Beaux Arts style is testament to that. As you can see in the picture that I have up now, that's the ceiling of the main banking area of the 4th Avenue branch. And you can see the ceiling includes a round fresco. And in that fresco, there are as many classical symbols such as cherubs and cornucopias and fruit that any immigrant coming from Europe would automatically recognize as being very fortuitous for saving money. The next slide is the entrance to the bank. You can see the 2 lions there, and those 2 lions actually sat outside on the entrance to the bank on 4th Avenue from 1871 to 2011, which they were then taken and brought inside. They were refurbished a little bit, but those are the actual lions that were carved on site by a German immigrant named Max Kohler in 1871. Close-up of the lion's face, and the lion symbology is designed to act as the protector of people's money and has been the symbol of the bank at least until the 1870s, if not previous. This is a photo, real quick, of the Heritage Center. There's rotating exhibits, and so I invite all of you, when the time becomes freer and we can move about, to come down and view the Heritage Center exhibits. It's open any day, any time during regular business hours under normal circumstances. Right now, it's closed to the public. And just an outside shot of the 4th Avenue building, you can see there are 2 other lions now. Those are exact replicas that were carved and brought in from Ohio and now sit in the same place on 4th Avenue for, let's say, maybe 150 years into the future. So, thank you very much. Now I'll pass it on to Michael Tusay, for our final presentation of the night. And after that, if you could maybe provide some feedback or questions, we'll have those answered by the panel. Thank you.
All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in tonight to learn a bit about Pittsburgh's immigrant history. My name is Michael Tusay. I am the current museum facilitator at Bushy Run Battlefield, located in Jeannette, Pennsylvania. Bushy Run is an 18th century battlefield and a state-owned historic site. I also was an intern, a historical studies intern with Dollar Bank in the fall of 2019 and the spring of 2020 before quarantine. And I graduated from Duquesne University with a traditional history Master of Arts degree with a minor in public history. So tonight, as Bob mentioned earlier, I will be discussing a bit of Pittsburgh's Italian immigrant history through this presentation titled Addio bel paese, ciao città d'acciaio. For those of you who do not know, Bel Paese is a common nickname for Italy, meaning beautiful country. The entire title then translates to Goodbye, beautiful country, hello, Steel City, or City of Steel. So to begin, I'll be giving you just a brief introduction of some Pittsburgh Italian immigrant history. I'll discuss a bit of Dollar Bank's connection to that history, in addition to my work at Dollar Bank, as well as components of Italian immigrant life. Sorry about my mask. While I do that, I'll be integrating some conversations or some narratives of notable Italian immigrants into that discussion. And I will end with a brief discussion on how Pittsburgh is preserving Italian heritage today. So to begin, there were very few Italian immigrants living in the United States prior to the 19th century. This changed in the United States between 1870 and 1900, primarily to escape rural poverty in Italy. I'm just going to take this off for now. I promise we are socially distanced, so we are still staying COVID friendly. But anyway, so many, like I was saying, many immigrants came to the United States to escape rural poverty, but also some came as refugees. At this time, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, Italy was going through a time of civil war and unrest, where the country was struggling to unify and gain independence from foreign rule. So, in 1870 in Pennsylvania, there were roughly 800 Italian immigrants. By 1900, there were approximately 66,000 Italian immigrants. So that is how quickly that number changed in such a short amount of time. In the United States as a whole, more than 4 million Italian immigrants came to the United States between 1880 and 1924. So much of this information is actually reflected in Dollar Bank's historic records. So some of you may be asking, how on earth is Dollar Bank connected to Italian immigrant history? Well, founded in 1855, this Dollar Bank is Pittsburgh's oldest surviving bank. This bank started and still is a bank for everyone and anyone, which means that they accepted and allowed people to open accounts, including African Americans, women, and immigrants from every country and region. So the bank itself is very rich in history and preserves its own history through its Heritage Center, where we are today in Dollar Bank's 4th Avenue location, in addition to preserving the history of its depositors. Now this is done through the preservation of the bank's historic ledgers, as Bob was describing to you earlier this evening. Now, these ledgers, specifically the signature ledgers, are what I spent most of my time with Dollar Bank combing through in order to compile database, or to compile information to create a database for various immigrants that are depositors of Dollar Bank, specifically Italian immigrants. Now, these ledgers yielded a shocking amount of information to me as I was going through them because of the way they are set up. So specifically with the signature ledgers, as a depositor came to the bank to open an account, they would personally sign their name in these ledgers if they could, and include information such as their age, gender, occupation, race, ethnicity, address, and even sometimes a physical description if they had some kind of identifying trait, or some prominent trait, such as like a scar or something like that. Now, the information within these signature ledgers is even more essential and important because of what it can be used for. This information can be used to identify trends among immigrant populations in the Pittsburgh area, as well as the overall Pittsburgh community. This graph here that Cassidee showed in her presentation previously is just one of the ways that these signature ledgers can be used. So this graph represents nationalities as a proportion of Dollar Bank's new immigrant depositors. So just to let you know, the Dollar Bank's first Italian depositor was Fortunato Cassidee. He opened a savings account in November of 1856. He was savings account number 698, and he was a plaster of Paris artisan in Pittsburgh. Now, as you can see here, Italian immigrants aren't even represented on this chart until almost the beginning of the 20th century, because in proportion to the other immigrant populations opening bank accounts here at Dollar Bank, the Italians really didn't become a larger or a more significant portion of those depositors until that beginning of the 20th century, which actually completely aligns with the influx in Italian immigration within that late 19th and early 20th century. All right, so upon coming to Pittsburgh and settling, several Italian communities were developed. Many Italian immigrants settled in areas like Bloomfield, which is known as Pittsburgh's Little Italy today, as well as East Liberty, the Lower Hill District, and also the Strip District and Southside. In addition to these communities, there were also community-based organizations that were established in order to provide bases of support and protection for immigrants as they adjusted to life in Western Pennsylvania. These were mutual aid societies. These societies were also established, or they also helped to establish health and life insurance policies for immigrants, paid for funeral expenses, and also played a social role for immigrants, providing space for leisure time and other activities. One example of this is the Adelaida Beneficial Society. This association was founded in 1924, located in Bloomfield, and provided an environment for Italian immigrants to learn about American traditions and American way of life. Now, as this beneficial society or beneficial association is no longer active, the building does still exist in Bloomfield today, just as a reminder of Italian immigrant heritage and early Italian immigrant history in Pittsburgh. All right, so this map here represents some mapped residences of Italian immigrants who came to Pittsburgh between 1855 and the early 1920. Now, as you can see, Italian immigrants resided kind of all over the place, according to this map. This is for several reasons. Like I previously mentioned, you can see a large cluster in the downtown region, specifically in the Strip District. You see some clusters getting into, moving toward Bloomfield, as well as the Southside. One interesting thing, though, to note about this map, these addresses came from the addresses listed in Dollar Bank's signature ledgers. Now, something that we just recently discovered is that one particular address in Penn Avenue kept popping up among different Italian immigrant depositors. Now, we just recently discovered that this address was actually the address for Penn Employment, which was an employment office. Now, this makes sense because employment offices would always need to know the location of the immigrants who were working out of that office and whatnot, which makes me think that also many of these addresses could also be their places of employment. So more research would definitely need to be done in order to really confirm if these were all residences or if some indeed were places of employment. All right, so this brings me to trades and labor. These were the primary reasons for many Italian immigrants to immigrate to Western Pennsylvania. Upon settling in Pittsburgh, many of them found work through skilled trades or general labor in occupations such as mining, railroad working, restaurant owning, fruit sales. Some worked as musicians, barbers, bakers, and so on. And again, much of this information is contained within Dollar Bank's signature ledgers. So one depositor of Dollar Bank's to note is a gentleman named Danny Narella. Now this gentleman, an Italian immigrant, was just recently featured on Dollar Bank's website and also through an exhibit here in Dollar Bank's Heritage Center. Danny Narella was born as Vincenzo di Narella in Italy, and he was the eldest of 3 brothers. His father, Carmelo or Carmen, immigrated to the United States, specifically to Pittsburgh in 1881, and found work in construction. Just 3 years later, Carmelo's wife and children were able to join him in Pittsburgh. Upon coming to Pittsburgh, all 3 of their kids, including Danny, took music lessons. Danny's instrument was the clarinet. So he found his passion in music and playing his clarinet and went on to play in many bands, including the Grand Army Band. Now, following this, and as he grew older, Danny eventually sailed to Europe in 1896 to study music formally at the Leipzig Conservatory, and he returned to Pittsburgh 2 years later and formed his own band. Soon after that, he assumed leadership of the 14th Regiment Band in 1901, soon to be called or known as Narella's 14th Regiment Band. This band grew rapidly in popularity and served as the headlining act for dozens of Pittsburgh events. Danny opened his account with Dollar Bank in 1899, and actually his brother Joe, who was also a musician, opened his account with Dollar Bank in 1917. Food is another major topic for Italian immigrant history. In addition to trades and labor, many immigrants also found work in the food industry. Similar to the trades and labor, with a growing immigrant population came a greater number of business opportunities. Specifically, there was a new demand for service-related businesses like restaurants, grocery stores, and saloons. Donatelli's Italian Food Center is just one example of an Italian family immigrant-owned grocery store. This is located in Bloomfield. It was founded in 1932 by Frank Donatelli, who was the son of immigrants from Calabria, Italy. And today, Frank's grandchildren actually continue to manage and run this business. Their names are Paul Jr. and Russell. And they continue to manage this business as a family tradition. So that's just one example of an Italian immigrant-owned business. Other examples include the Tambellini restaurant and grocery store, which no longer are here in Pittsburgh. Several of the Tambellini family members were also depositors at Dollar Bank. Another example is Pittsburgh's beloved, renowned Permane Brothers restaurant. Similar to the growing businesses, or specifically service-related businesses, there was also a new wave of religious traditions and culture in Pittsburgh, specifically through the Italian immigrant population. Faith and religion was an integral component of Italian immigrant everyday life, specifically Catholicism. With that, and as a result, dozens of churches and all Italian parishes were established in the Pittsburgh area. The Immaculate Conception Church, shown in this image here, is just one example. It was founded in 1905, 1906 in Bloomfield, and it was one of the first institutions established solely for the Italian immigrant community in Pittsburgh. Other examples include the Madonna del Castello, located in Swissvale, the Regina Coeli Church, which is now closed, that was located in the north side, and St. Perpetua Church, located in McKeesport. All right, and that brings me to today. So today, Pittsburgh is still working toward preserving its Italian immigrant heritage and Italian heritage through various ways. I'll share with you now just a few specific tangible ways that is happening. One is through the University of Pittsburgh's Italian Room, located in the university's Cathedral of Learning, and in addition to its many other nationality rooms. The Italian Room, work began on that in 1927. Because of World War II, that work was delayed, but eventually it was completed in May of 1949. The room itself is reminiscent of a 15th century Tuscan monastery. And inside the room, as you can sort of see in the picture, there are benches which now serve as desks for students. And on the back of these benches is inscribed the Italian University founding dates. In addition to that, there are also tributes in the room to various Renaissance artists. Another example is the Senator John Heinz History Center. The History Center has specifically an Italian-American collection. Now, this collection was founded in 1990, and it is actually one of the largest repositories of artifacts, photos, oral histories, and archival materials in the United States, specifically pertaining to Italian immigrant history and Italian heritage in the United States. In addition to that collection, they also host an Italian Heritage Day annually, which celebrates Italian heritage in Pittsburgh. And one of the major things that program offers is a way for families to learn together through hands-on activities about Italian heritage, in addition to learning that you can always celebrate your Italian heritage, and it's not just one day or looking back in the past. It's something to celebrate every day of the year. And finally, another example I have here is actually a project that I developed through a course at Duquesne. It is titled Pittsburgh's Italian Heritage, a virtual tour of the Italian heritage sites in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And it's actually a virtual tour of several physical sites that either still exist or sort of exist in Pittsburgh that you can actually see or go to see today. So hopefully, as of right now, that project is not on any platform that makes it readily accessible to the public yet, but it is a hope that one day it might be, just to encourage you all to learn even more about Italian immigrant history and Italian heritage in Pittsburgh. So with that, I thank you all, and I thank Dollar Bank and Duquesne for hosting this evening, and I wish you all a good night.
Mille grazie, Michael. So we're going to wrap up tonight with the question and answer session. Professor Simpson from Duquesne is fielding questions via the chat in real time. So feel free to ask a question, and then we'll have the answer put to the panel. Professor Simpson, if you'd like to start.
Excellent, thank you. And again, I want to encourage folks, we've already got some great questions in the chat, but for other folks who are wanting to ask some questions, please go ahead and submit them. I'm going to start with a question that's going to go to all three panelists. The question writes, it seems that Dollar Bank, even from the beginning, was very inclusive for almost all nationalities. Was that something that was discovered by looking back, or part of the active strategy of the bank when it began? And this actually can speak toward, I think, as well, toward some of the research that you all have done for that event.
So I think I would say that it is an active strategy of the bank from the beginning, because with being able to open up your bank account with just $1 in the beginning, this was a real person's bank. It was meant to help the city of Pittsburgh rather than just accumulate more money. I don't know, anybody else?
Yeah, I would definitely agree and say that it was definitely a strategy in mind from the beginning. I'm not sure if there are records that exist that definitively state that or not, but I would definitely agree with Cassidee because of the way the bank was functioning, and again, with that you only needed $1 to open an account. Many immigrants came with little to no money to the United States, so it almost catered to immigrant communities and various demographics that other banks would not necessarily cater to because of that reason alone.
Yeah, I also think that this is something that you definitely see carrying through to the bank's culture today. Just thinking a little bit about some oral histories that we had worked on, that I had helped transcribe when I was here. Really, the community and the welcoming atmosphere of the bank came through in a lot of those.
Excellent. I think it also speaks to the importance of institution building, and the lasting effects of institution building on how Pittsburgh's community has been shaped. This is a question for Anna. Can you talk about the cultural and historical significance of the Oliver Bathhouse on the South Side?
I got you.
No. I know that it is culturally and historically significant, but I don't have that research here, but I would love to look into it.
Excellent. This is a question again for all three panelists. One of the challenges that we've sort of seen as historians of immigration, when they've told the story about immigration over the course of the 20th century, has been the way that employers have typically, employers but also communities, have pitted immigrant groups against each other. This questioner specifically references Chicago prior to the New Deal. And they ask, what do you see are the relationships between immigrant groups? And all of you told stories of different groups here in Pittsburgh. And do we see a story of conflict, or do we see a story of consensus? And what's that legacy moving forward?
I mean, I think in the narratives that I shared and that I collected during the Southside Voices Oral History Project, there's definitely a spirit of cooperation there. That's not to say that there was always, or these are the stories that people are choosing to share, and I think that that's also an important aspect to realize, that these are the stories that residents of the South Side are creating and sharing, and so I saw definitely harmony there.
Great, and I want to apologize. We're having some audio-visual difficulties.
Oh.
Just to sort of, on my end, just to repeat, we're asking a question about how we saw Pittsburgh immigrant groups. Did they work together? Was there conflict? And this questioner was looking at the example of Chicago, and I don't know if Michael or Cassidee wish to respond to this.
I'm not very well versed in relations between that many immigrant communities in Pittsburgh specifically. However, I would say that it would probably be a bit of both. I'm sure that, of course, there was some conflict at some time, but also a sense of cooperation, mostly because everyone was sort of in the same boat as they were coming to the United States. They were looking for similar opportunities for similar reasons. And as they settled specifically in the Pittsburgh area for nearly all different immigrant communities, specific organizations and different things were established, some relating to faith, some relating to just general community. And I'm sure that can be said of other immigrant communities as well. So in my mind, at least, given that and given research that I've done through newspaper articles and things, again, specifically pertaining to Pittsburgh, I would say, yeah, there was probably a general sense of cooperation. And I'm sure, again, like always, a bit of conflict at times, per se.
I think in terms of Irish in Pittsburgh, I don't think the other immigrant populations were the ones degrading them. It was usually what they considered native-born Americans. So I think because of the same lived experience and through my study of Pittsburgh steel in the area, you were mixing all of these different ethnicities into one shared experience, say of Pittsburgh steel and the hardships of working with Pittsburgh steel. I think where there can be animosity, there's also such a shared experience. It'd be almost impossible that these groups in one way, shape, or form wouldn't get along.
Excellent. Thank you all. Thank you all very much. We have another question coming in that's asking what your most interesting experience working in Dollar Bank's archival materials was.
I can start. So, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of my work was doing pulling information directly from the signature ledgers here at Dollar Bank and pulling demographic information from the depositors found in those ledgers and kind of using that for different ways, sometimes to create exhibits or to write small articles for the bank or to produce a larger project or look at larger trends. So there were always, in my experience at Dollar Bank, I was tasked with kind of analyzing or studying very specific, notable depositors from time to time. And I think that part was always the most interesting to me because I used a lot of Ancestry.com, and because the ledgers provide so much information, you really can find a lot more information than about those people, either through newspaper articles or through Ancestry.com. And piecing together the family trees of those people and their history, and sometimes they have very colorful pasts, that was probably the most interesting and the most fun experience I had here at the bank.
At my time at Dollar Bank, I began in spring of 2020, and then of course COVID hit, and I ended up finishing up that work in fall. I was able to do a lot of research on the various presidents here at Dollar Bank, and it was really interesting to go into some of these ledgers, these meeting notes from way, way back, and to see how Dollar Bank changed and progressed over time was very fascinating. And just the fact that you sometimes get to put your hands on something that's from like 1850, and it's just the wonder I think a lot of archivists and even non-historic community people feel when they get to embrace this kind of history.
Excellent. Well, thank you. We've got a question, and I don't know if we're going to be able to get a direct answer to this. One of our questioners has asked, did anyone know offhand the percentage of the population in the Southside that was made up of people of Slavic descent? And he mentions that his father was Polish and grew up there, and as a child going into the 1960s, it seemed to be a much more overwhelmingly Russian and Polish neighborhood than perhaps it appears today. I don't know if that's come through in any oral history interviews.
I don't think so. Cassidee and I both interned for Southside Voices, and she's also shaking her head. And I definitely don't have that that specific figure. But again, there's these interviews are really just scratching the surface. Mm-hmm. There's so much there. Yeah, I wish I had that answer. I don't.
Yeah. I'm not sure about Southside directly in relation, especially again to steel. A place of interest might be Homestead or even Braddock. Those neighborhoods are oftentimes Slavic heavy, but I'm not sure of the exact numbers in the South Side.
All right, well, excellent. I think we've got time for just a couple more questions. If folks want to go ahead and put them in the chat. But we really appreciate everybody's attendance this evening, and thank you all for joining us. So if there's any more questions, please feel free to put them in. All right. I think that probably concludes the question and answer portion of the evening. I'm going to turn it back over to Mr. Presutti to go ahead and close. Thank you all very much.
just want to note, as a final note, thank you for tuning in. It really means a lot to us who put this on. You could have done anything tonight. You chose to spend it with us, so thank you very much. We want you to know that the people that work at Dollar Bank and the people that are in Duquesne History Department, we're all Pittsburghers too. So this history is very, very important to us. And as a mutual bank, I hope that in the future you'll see Dollar Bank as Pittsburgh's community bank when you see our name. So thank you very much, and be sure to look out for future events in the speaker series and tell your friends and family. So thank you very much. Have a good night.